The alarm clock buzzed, its shrill sound cutting through the silence of the early morning. 6 a.m., just like yesterday and the day before. The same monotonous routine, day in and day out. He reached over, silenced the insistent buzzing, and climbed out of bed. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if he were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The world outside the window was still dark, the sky a deep, unsettling indigo. The city was asleep, unaware of the quiet turmoil brewing within him. He went through the motions of his morning routine, each action rote, automatic, brushing his teeth, making coffee. Everything felt like a scene from a movie he had watched 1,000 times. Shower, shave, coffee, toast. The same sequence, the same steps, repeated endlessly, yet today there was an undercurrent of something different, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But something felt different, a subtle shift in the air, like a faint tremor before an earthquake. It was as if the universe was trying to tell him something, a message hidden in the mundane. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains seemed amplified, echoing in his mind. Every time he glanced at the window, he imagined a flicker of movement in the periphery, a fleeting shape disappearing into the shadows. His heart would race, only to slow down when he realized it was nothing. He told himself it was just the wind, his reflection playing tricks on him, but the feeling of unease persisted, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. But deep down a seed of unease had been planted. It grew with each passing moment, a silent reminder that something was not quite right. He couldn't help but wonder if today would be the day that everything changed, the day that the familiar would give way to the unknown. He left for work as usual, the early morning air crisp and cool. The city was still in that delicate balance between night and day, where the shadows of the night had not yet fully retreated, and the first light of dawn was just beginning to paint the sky with hues of pink and orange. The familiar sounds of the city were just beginning to stir, the distant rumble of a truck, the chirping of birds greeting the dawn. It was a symphony of subtle noises that marked the beginning of a new day, a routine he had grown accustomed to over the years. He fell into step with the other commuters, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. Each person seemed lost in their own world, their thoughts hidden behind the shadows cast by the early morning sun. The city was waking up, but its inhabitants were still caught in the haze of sleep. He noticed a woman walking towards him, her face obscured by a large floppy hat. There was something about her that caught his attention, a certain grace in her step, a mystery in the way she held herself. As they drew closer, he felt a jolt of recognition, a strange sense of familiarity. It was as if he had seen her before, in a dream or a distant memory that he couldn't quite place. His heart skipped a beat, and he found himself staring, trying to remember where he knew her from. But as they passed, he realized he'd never seen her before in his life. The recognition was fleeting, like a whisper in the wind, gone before he could grasp it. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of confusion that had settled over him. He glanced back, but she was gone, swallowed by the throng of people. It was as if she had never been there, a ghostly apparition that had vanished into the morning crowd. He felt a pang of loss, a strange emptiness that he couldn't quite explain. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. After all, the city was full of strangers, and it wasn't unusual to see a face that seemed familiar. He tried to push the encounter out of his mind, focusing instead on the day ahead. Yet the encounter left him unsettled. A discordant note in the symphony of his day. It was a small thing, a brief moment in the grand scheme of his life, but it lingered with him, a nagging feeling that something was out of place. As he continued on his way, he couldn't shake the sense that the day had started on an unusual note, and he wondered what else the morning had in store for him. Arriving at his office, he tried to immerse himself in his work, hoping the routine tasks would help him forget the strange encounter. The office was already bustling with activity, the hum of conversations and the clatter of keyboards filling the air. But even as he settled into his desk, the image of the woman in the floppy hat lingered in the back of his mind. Throughout the day, he found himself glancing out the window, his thoughts drifting back to that moment on the street. The city outside seemed to move on as usual, oblivious to the small mystery that had unsettled him. He wondered if he would ever see her again, or if she would remain just a fleeting memory, a discordant note in the symphony of his life. The day at work dragged on, each hour an eternity. The minutes seemed to stretch, elongating into an endless stream of monotony. The office, usually bustling with activity, felt like a prison, each tick of the clock a reminder of the time that refused to pass. He found it difficult to concentrate, his mind constantly drawn back to the strange occurrences of the morning. The odd noises, the flickering lights, and the inexplicable feeling of being watched had unsettled him deeply. Every time he tried to focus on his work, his thoughts would drift back to those eerie moments. The feeling of being watched persisted, a constant presence lurking at the edge of his awareness. It was as if unseen eyes were following his every move, scrutinizing him from the shadows. He couldn't shake the sensation, no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it as mere paranoia. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself it was just stress or lack of sleep. Maybe he was overworked, or perhaps the recent string of late nights was finally catching up to him. He took deep breaths, sipped his coffee, and rubbed his temples, but the unease remained. But the shadows seemed to lengthen around him, the air in the office growing heavy and oppressive. The once familiar environment now felt alien and threatening. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, sinister shadows that crept along the walls as if alive. The clock on the wall ticked by with agonizing slowness, each tick a hammer blow to his nerves. He found himself constantly checking the time, tapping his fingers impatiently on the desk. The relentless ticking seemed to mock him, amplifying his anxiety. He longed for the day to be over, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the office and the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. As the evening twilight approached, he packed up his belongings with a weary expression, relief washing over him as he finally stepped out of the building. The cool evening air felt like a balm, soothing his frayed nerves, yet even as he walked away, the sense of unease lingered, a shadow that refused to be left behind.